Welcome to Optimus Minimus, and today we're gonna discuss the movies about the Trojan War and how they connect with the source material, Greek and Roman mythology. Obviously, there were lots of movies about Troy, so we're gonna limit ourselves with the films and TV series released in the past 20 years. Namely, Helen of Troy miniseries, released in 2003, Troy, a film from 2004, and Troy, Fall of a City, a BBC One Netflix miniseries from 2018. First of all, we must say that any attempts for the revisionism of the myths, a significantly different way of retelling the story, it's nothing new. Ancient Greeks did it all the time. The classic Greek tragedies, especially the ones by Euripides, is the best example. Also, there are different versions of the myths, and sometimes they just contradict each other. Most of the time, when you watch the movie, you just can't say, this is wrong, because this isn't how it happened in, say, the Iliad. Interpretations are okay, a different angle is okay, everything is okay, well, except when it's actually wrong, stupid, and too much. So, as I said earlier, we observe how the modern version of the myth works with the classical myth, and try very hard to judge or condemn something only when it is absolutely necessary, or if it makes a good joke. In that case, we can ignore all common sense completely. Come on, filmmakers do it all the time, and it works. Another important thing we should remember is what constitutes this source material I mentioned. It is not only Homer, it's not only the Iliad. I must remind you that the Iliad covers only a small episode of the Trojan War. Actually, it is less than 2 months in the 10th year of the war, from the 9 days of plague and a conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles, and to the funeral of Hector. None of the films use the Iliad as their only source, because they cover all the war, from the very beginning until the fall of Troy. So yes, when we're talking about the source material, it is not only Homer, and it is not only the Greek authors. Some of the most important material on the Trojan War comes from the Roman period, which includes Aeneid by Virgil. By the way, Aeneid is kind of the original source for the description of the Trojan horse and the fall of Troy in our culture. Everyone who mentions the Trojan horse is not referring to Homer, they refer to Virgil, or more formally Publius Vergilius Maro, who wrote in Latin many centuries after Homer. And now I think we're finished with the necessary introduction, and we are ready to move to the movies themselves. All 3 films and miniseries cover all of the Trojan War, since the very beginning and until the fall of Troy. What is interesting, it seems that none of the movies actually tell us that the Trojan War lasted for 10 years. Peterson's Troy openly mocks this idea, or the war takes mere days. And don't get me wrong, I don't think it's a bad idea, it works quite well for the film. The 2 miniseries, well, the war takes time, but it is never explicitly specified how much time exactly. Years probably. Helen of Troy is more concerned with, well, Helen, and all the combat is a bit in the background. Troy? just like the Iliad, is more about Achilles and Hector. Troy, Fall of a City, combines everything but more focused on the Trojan perspective. Also, the running time of Troy, Fall of a City is something about 7 hours, 8 episodes, 50-55 minutes each. You may think that they had more time for character development than the other two movies, which is true, but not really. Helen of Troy is clocking around 3 hours, and the director's cut of Troy is around 3:15. All three movies are into revisionism, rather than straightforward retelling of the main sources. And as I mentioned, some of the myths actually contradict each other. And now, for the convenience of pretty much everybody, we will split this discussion into different parts, dealing with the characters or groups of characters and prominent episodes. So we could see how all of this is treated in each of the films in particular. So let's start from the beginning. Judgement of Paris. In a way, the main catalyst of the event is the so-called Judgement of Paris. Paris has to choose between three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, and decide who's the most beautiful, and give her the apple which goddess Iris smuggled to the celebration of the marriage of Peleus and Thetis. All of the goddesses try to bribe Paris. What else would you expect? And Paris chooses Aphrodite because she promised him the most beautiful woman in the world. These days, it is usually seen as a good choice, and Paris instantly becomes some kind of a romantic hero. The guy chooses love, Aphrodite, over power, Hera, or military strength, Athena. This is not how it was seen by the Greeks. They perceived the choice as weird and kinda indecent. Mostly because it is indeed a weird choice and slightly indecent, even from the modern perspective. Because, well, Aphrodite is not a goddess of love. She's the goddess of beauty and of passion and lust. So Aphrodite kind of bribes Paris with a person whom he never met and has no information apart from the fact that she's the most beautiful woman in the world. That's enough for him. She could be a piece of meat that is absolutely fine with him. She could be a complete idiot or a total monster inside, a horrible wild creature. Not his problem. Give me the beauty queen, give me Miss World. Was Helen a monster, apart from physical appearance, and a horrible wild creature? Well, according to the most sources, yes. Helen was usually seen as a villain. For example, a famous encomium of Helen, a speech in the defense of Helen, written by the sophist Gorgias, is an exercise on the power of persuasion. He chose Helen as the subject of his defense because Helen's advocate, for an ancient Greek, is the same as the devil's advocate for us. So what do we see in the movies? There are no gods in Wolfgang Petersen's Troy, so naturally there is no Judgement of Paris. There is the judgment in both other films, but it is romanticized in Helen of Troy. Paris and Helen actually see each other through some kind of magic. She sees him in the water, he sees her in the apple. It is a nice touch for a love story. although slightly stupid, and not very well thought in terms of chronology. In the timeline of the movie, she's a pre-adolescent teen at this point, which is probably slightly awkward. Not for the Greeks, though. This fact is also hidden by the age of the actress. She was something around 30 at the time of the release of Helen of Troy. And she played Helen at the age of, I guess, 13, and into her 20s as well. And it looks a bit strange when a 30-year-old woman imitates behavior of her child. But sometimes you just forget the age of the character and perceive Helen as a, full-grown adult. The source material, by the way, also has its deal of chronological problems. Pretty much everyone agrees that the Judgement of Paris happened right after this incident at the wedding celebrations of Peleus and Thetis. And Peleus and Thetis are the parents of Achilles, which makes Paris, also known as Alexander, something like, give or take, 16 or even 20 years older than Achilles. Nobody cares, and it is obviously never seen in any of the movies. Also, according to the Iliad, in the 10th year of war, Achilles fights alongside his grown-up son, Neoptolemus. So if you do the math, that means that by the end of the Trojan War, Paris was probably like 55, 60 years of age. And so was Helen. The gods. As I mentioned before, Peterson's Troy takes a realistic approach, so there are no gods there. Except for Thetis, but she is presented as a mortal. With all due respect for Judy Christie's portrayal of Thetis, it is not a depiction of a Greek goddess. There are gods in Helen of Troy, but they have a very limited presence. There are gods in Troy Fall of a City as well, and it created a certain controversy, as you probably know. The thing is, some of the gods in the Netflix miniseries are black, including Artemis and Zeus. Can it be justified? I guess I will disappoint many people, but probably yes. It is understandable that people complain about things like that. We all can see the statues of the Greek gods, and all of them are obviously white, because they are the Greek gods. What do you expect? So it is absolutely normal to defend the position that the Greek gods should look like Greek statues or paintings. It gets a bit more complicated if you know that ancient Greeks, and Romans as well, thought that there is a certain set of gods, but they have different names and they look differently in other parts of the world. When Herodotus describes Egyptian gods, he gives us Greek names, because for him, they are the same gods, just, localized version. Apollo can be marketed to the Egyptian audience as a person with the head of a crocodile, and it's normal for the Greek. And Julius Caesar mentions the gods of the Celts, or the Gauls, and they are the same Greco-Roman gods for him, just with a different makeup and with a different name. For instance, he quickly identifies the main god of the Gauls as Mercury. No problem for him. Different audience, different market. Gods can have pretty much any appearance. So if you keep this approach of the ancient Greeks and Romans in mind, Yeah, this seemingly strange casting decision can be easily justified. Achilles. Achilles is the main character of the Iliad. He is also the main character in Peterson's Troy and a prominent supporting character in Fall of a City. He's fairly insignificant in Helen of Troy and mostly presented as some sort of a caricature, and not the Achilles one might expect. Let's get the question of the physical appearance of Achilles out of the way. As we already said, one of the most publicized features of Fall of a City was its unorthodox casting approach. And it can easily be justified when we're talking about the gods. Unfortunately, you can't say the same about characters like Achilles, or Patroclus, Aeneas, or Nestor. I know that the creators of the show probably had all the best intentions in the world, but Achilles had a light shade of hair, probably even blonde. And he was from Phthia, not from Africa. Now, there are people that defend the decision of casting black actors as Greeks, or Achaeans to be precise, and they discuss what the word Xanthes, which is mentioned in the Iliad, actually means. But it means what it means, and Black Achilles is a bit too much. And criticism of these casting decisions has nothing to do with the racism. This kind of depiction of the characters is just wildly inaccurate, absolutely uncalled for, and looks forced. The positive side here is only that, if you forget about the physical appearance for a moment, the portrayal of Achilles in Fall of a City by David Jesse has much more in common with the prototype than what we see in Helen of Troy, where Achilles is just a mindless brute. So in the end, Brad Pitt in Troy, yeah, he looks like Achilles, pretty much. What happens to the character in all of these films? Well, he dies eventually, as expected. I mentioned that because we're talking about the movie adaptations, and sometimes characters who die in the myths are pretty much alive by the end of the film. But not Achilles. He's killed every time. And he is killed by Paris. Every time. The circumstances are a bit different. In Peterson's Troy, he even dies during the sack of the city. According to the myths, the circumstances were quite different as well. Yes, it's always Paris again, but he's either assisted by Apollo, or it is actually Apollo disguised as Paris. Or maybe even Paris disguised as Apollo. Why not? And they aim at his heel. Duh. Although in the movies he is quite vulnerable in all other places as well. By the way, one of the most interesting versions of the myth tells that Achilles fell in love with King Priam's daughter, Polyxena, and tried to jump ship. And he was killed by Paris/Apollo exactly when he was heading for Troy, for marriage and, to actually fight for the Trojans. Most of the versions usually say that the shadow of Achilles, after his death, demanded Polyxena to be sacrificed to him, so he could have a wife in the afterlife. And Polyxena was okay with this idea. There is no Polyxena in any of the movies we're talking about, but in a way, she's there under a different name, at least in Peterson's Troy. The character of Briseis, played by Rose Byrne, is essentially an amalgam of Briseis from the myths and Polyxena. Original Briseis is not a relative of King Priam. She was just a daughter of a guy called Briseis. That's what her name means, a daughter of Briseis. Well, it's not a real name, her real name is Hippodamia. And she's not even from Troy, she was a wife of a prince from the town of Lyrnessus, which was sacked by Achilles. And she was taken as a prize. And her husband was killed by Achilles. And her father hanged himself after his house was destroyed by Achilles. Polyxena, on the other hand, indeed was a relative of Priam, his daughter, and she was from Troy. Since in this part of the video we're talking not only about Achilles, but about other closely connected characters, we should also discuss Patroclus. There is no Patroclus in Helen of Troy miniseries, or maybe he is just hiding. But he's a relatively important secondary character in the other two movies. But he is always a bit, let's call it, underpowered and dies rather quickly, because he's essentially a plot device that sends Achilles on a rampage that costs Hector his life. And yeah, in Fall of a City he is also involved in a threesome with Achilles and Briseis, which is, well, it is a crying shame, really. It is not inspired by the myths, it is inspired by pornography. Indeed, close and very special friendship between Achilles and his relative Patroclus is a recurring theme since the ancient times, although there's nothing about it in the Iliad itself. It was obviously considered absolutely normal. Kind of. Some of the sources say that Achilles was the passive partner, which implies that Patroclus was actually older than Achilles, which is a bit weird because he's usually seen as basically a protege of Achilles. And if Achilles was older, then he couldn't be passive because it makes no sense whatsoever, and it's a bit obscene if you're a Greek. Anyway, it all has little to do with this pure cringe that we see in Fall of a City. What they don't really show much in the movies is that Patroclus from the Iliad was a very, very capable warrior. He was on fire when he impersonated Achilles and even killed a prominent Trojan ally, Sarpedon, son of Zeus. And yeah, Patroclus wasn't killed by Hector easily and practically effortlessly. No. In fact, Patroclus was probably a better fighter than Hector. Hector just couldn't kill him in one-on-one combat. He was assisted by Apollo and a guy called Euphorbus, who actually did most of the work, which contributed to the rage of Achilles towards Hector. He believed that although Hector technically killed Patroclus, he just couldn't do it in a fair fight. We can probably talk about Achilles for hours, as he's the main character of the Iliad, but we should limit ourselves, so I'll try to wrap everything up somehow, slowly. What should be emphasized here is that Achilles is actually a relatively complicated character. He's not Achilles from Helen of Troy, he's more like Brad Pitt's or David Jesse's Achilles. He's a person dealing with his fate, and in the Iliad he knows he's gonna die during the Trojan War. His destiny was revealed to him. Hector, a Trojan counterpart of Achilles, is pretty sure that Troy will fall, and he will die, and his wife will become a slave, and his only son will be killed. He's pretty sure, but he's not 100% sure. This is not the case with Achilles. He knows. and this fact kind of dominates the character in the Iliad. This and obviously questions of honor and glory. But we will talk about it a bit later when we will move to Agamemnon. We also must mention another quite important character closely connected with Achilles. Neoptolemus, his son. He's completely ignored by the screenwriters. You cannot find him in any of these three movies. Maybe because they try to limit the number of important characters that draw attention too much. Maybe because the fact that Achilles has an adult son kind of complicates the chronology. But Neoptolemus is in the Iliad, and unlike his father, he survives the war and comes back home. Neoptolemus directly contributed to the collective acts of hubris committed by the Greeks. He killed King Priam while the king was holding the altar, so he was under protection of the gods. Neoptolemus also took Hector's wife, Andromache, as a slave, and he had a son with her. His wife didn't like it at all, but we will talk about it a little bit later. Now we will finish with Achilles and his friends and family, and move to other characters of importance. Helen. As we mentioned before, she was mostly seen as a very shrewd character. Helen is a bad guy. There were some variants of the myths though, but first we will start with her physical appearance in the source materials and in the movies. Well, her skin is described as pale, as ancient Greek women are not usually exposed to the sun, unless they are slaves and work in the field. And her hair is not described in the Iliad, but usually in other sources. She's xanthous, like pretty much any hero, including Achilles. Helen's and Peterson's Troy and in Helen of Troy miniseries, Diane Kruger and Sienna Guillory respectively, are blonde. Helen in Fall of a City, Belladane, is a brunette. Is it weird? It is a difficult question, and I have to say that yes, it is. Okay, Helen was a daughter of Zeus and Leda, which is mentioned in Helen of Troy. She also was born from an egg. Obviously, no movie mentions the fact. It is an odd thing to bring up. I don't want to promote prejudice, but I believe that it is generally a good rule of thumb not to trust a person who was born from an egg. Helen's sister, or more precisely half-sister, Clytemnestra, was born from an egg too, and she turned out just... well, we'll talk about it later. But she kind of proves that, yeah, people who hatched from an egg should be treated with a certain degree of suspicion. Helen had a daughter with Menelaus, Hermione. 2 movies out of 3 doesn't mention that fact. Maybe because it makes the idea of her life story less romantic. Only Fall of a City addresses the issue, which adds certain depth to the character. Later, Hermione will be married to Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, and she is actually that wife who we've mentioned before, the one who didn't like the fact that Neoptolemus had a child with Andromache. Eventually, Orestes showed up, Hermione's cousin, son of Agamemnon, and killed Neoptolemus, and then married Hermione, who was kind of promised to him. What is funny here is that, according to Euripides, who was a keen revisionist of the myths, Orestes and his sister Electra previously kidnapped Hermione and used her as a hostage when they tried to escape after a failed attempt to kill her mother, Helen. Yeah, Orestes killed not only his mother, Clytemnestra, but tried to kill Helen as well, and then married her daughter. Well, after all, the House of Atreus was a prominent train wreck of epic proportions. The bar actually was set so high that Orestes was considered probably the most normal of any other person from his bloodline. And he stopped the curse. Back to Helen. So, she's a shrewd character, but only Fall of a City tries to show this side of Helen. But none of the movies actually show that at some points of the story she wasn't impressed by Paris, like after his fight with Menelaus. Nobody mentions that after Paris died, she got married again to his younger brother, Deiphobus. Deiphobus is present in Fall of a City miniseries, but dies the same day as Paris, and he is never linked with Helen herself. In the myths, he dies as well, after he is terribly tortured and mutilated by the Greeks. And Helen, well, she couldn't care less. She just comes back to Menelaus and they live happily ever after. In a way. At least according to Homer. Fall of a City has certain episodes discussing Helen's motherhood, including the episode where she says that she's not really cut for this. It kinda adds certain depth to the character. Other films don't mention anything at all, including the existence of Hermione. But, well, there are myths that say that Helen and Paris actually had a child, a daughter, and her name was Helena. Supposedly she was killed by Hecuba, her grandmother. And there is a version where they had 3 sons. All of them died in Troy. While in Troy, Helen exhibited a very, let's call it, strange behavior. But once again, myths frequently contradict each other. In Odyssey, there is a famous account of Helen imitating voices of the wives of the Greek heroes as she walks around the horse, which is a slightly odd thing. Apparently, she suspected that the Greeks were inside and wanted them to reveal themselves. But, well, it's a bit weird. And that's not all. There are also accounts that after the death of Paris, she actually actively helped Greeks, and Odysseus in particular, to take the city. Who waved the torch to signal the troops that the gates of Troy are open? Well, some myths say that it was Helen. All in all, as already been said, Helen is more of a villain. But as always with the myths, you have different versions and you have ancient revisionism. In the previous video, which serves as an introduction, we briefly discussed that there's a story of the Phantom Helen, quite prominently featured in the tragedy. Well, it is more of a comedy really, called Helen, written by Euripides. It is a completely different version of Helen. It is a Helen who was waiting for her husband for 17 years, in Egypt of all places, while Menelaus was fighting for the apparition, Eidolon, and then tries to get back home, which takes some time. This version, by the way, supported not only by the king of revisionism himself, Euripides, but also by Herodotus. This special limited edition of Helen is not always an entirely faithful wife. In one version, she is teleported to Egypt by Hera, who just hated Paris. But in another version, she ended up in Egypt after her abduction by Paris. Nobody makes movies about that Helen, or about her phantom. And this is where we stop for today. Please stay tuned for the second part of the video. So don't forget to subscribe and activate the notifications. You should press these bell symbols, as you probably know. If you have something to say, I strongly encourage you to leave a comment. So thanks for watching and see you soon.